Hampton Public Library's Mariners Museum program. This is Wisteria Perry, and she'll be telling us about Africans and African Americans in the maritime world. And thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. And I'm glad for those of you in-house as well as those online. And as mentioned, this program is African and African Americans in the maritime world. And I am from the Mariners Museum and Park. We're actually about 10 minutes, if that. Well, the way I drive it may not be 10, but we're not that far from where we are right now. And we're just going to jump right into the presentation. And again, if you do have questions, if you're in-house, feel free to just ask them. If you're online, you can type it into the chat box and we can answer those as we're going about. And I have lots of images and some notes here that you see me holding here just to make sure that I don't forget parts of the story. But this is one of our initiatives at the Mariners Museum and Park. It's what we call our multicultural mariner. And we really want to kind of look at the stories that you don't always, that are not very common, that you don't always hear. And with it being February and it's designated as Black History Month, this is just something that we find near and dear to our heart, but we also continue those stories throughout the year. Now let's make sure my clicker decides to work. And it does not want to behave, so let's see. All right, we're going to do this old school style. And I'll just be turning back and forth in there. Oh, let's see. There we go. All right, so one of the things that I always like when we start talking about Black maritime history is I always like to go to symbols. And one of my favorite symbols is called Sankofa. And Sankofa has kind of two different symbols. One is just a bird looking behind it. The other is the bird looking behind it, but kind of looking at almost a egg sort of shape. And then there's also a heart. But one thing, regardless of which one that you're looking at, Sankofa means to reach back and get it. And to me, it's kind of going with this saying that it's not wrong to go back for that which has been forgotten. Really, it is not wrong for us to go back and look at the past to kind of look at how our present and future is going to shape up. And Sankofa is a symbol. The wording comes from the Akan, which is a language that you find in Ghana. And there's a lot of different symbols, and you've probably seen them, everything from the bird. There's also a crocodile kind of shape, and that one's kind of looking at adaptability because crocodiles can live on both land as well as water. And it's kind of the same thing with we humans, is that we can be very adaptable to our situations. But for this presentation, we're looking to our past to kind of bring things to the future. Now, in order to talk about Black maritime history, we do have to kind of take it all the way back to the continent. Because as you're looking at this image here, let's see, this actually works in house here, you'll see a lot of these different colored shapes. And actually, there would be a lot more of them on this map. But those shapes are going to represent different kingdoms and civilizations that were scattered throughout the history of Africa. So, of course, right here, you've got Egypt. Over here, you've got Northern Africa. So you have the civilization of ancient Carthage, which is part of Tunisia today. If we move down to the west coast of Africa, there's a number of different kingdoms. But if you're a third grader in the state of Virginia, the three main ones that you're going to be studying particularly is Mali. But when you talk about Mali, you also have to talk about the Empire of Ghana, which came before it. And then you have the Empire of Songhai that comes behind it. And really what you're looking at is in this area, you'll see this is Ghana. Then as Ghana falls into its decline, then Mali is going to rise, but it absorbs all of the things that you find from Ghana. And then the same thing for Songhai. As it has its rise, it is going to take a portion of the Mali Empire, looking at some of the traditions, the kings and all that. Now, since we are talking about those kingdoms, let's go back to ancient Egypt. And this one right here, the image that you see there is Queen Hatshepsut. And her name means foremost of noble women. And she was considered to be one of the most successful pharaohs through the Egyptian dynasty. She was actually the 5th pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. And the reason why that we like to talk about her is that as you look at some of the primary sources, one of which is actually going to be her tomb, there were actually cartouches on board letting people know that there was a very successful shipping, trading going on between and other parts of the known world at that point. But on her tomb, there's actually an inscription, and her tomb is at the entrance of the Valley of the Kings. And the inscription in part says, loading of ships that are very heavy with the marble of the country of Punt. All godly fragrances of God's land, heaps of myrrh, fresh with myrrh trees, with ebony, pure ivory, with the green gold of emu, cinnamon wood, 2 kinds of incense, eye cosmetics, with apes, monkeys, dogs, with the skins of the southern panther, with natives and their children. Never was brought the like of this for any king who has been since the beginning. So much so that her story is not just on her tomb, but you'll see up here at the top that in Egypt, they've actually put, and I'm missing my word, this vessel and this voyage actually on the country stamp. And that's just one of many with that. Now over here, this is a ship model that we have on display at the Mariners Museum in part. And it's simply listed as an Egyptian seagoing vessel. And so it's very similar to what was actually drawn on the walls of her tomb. Now, that's the only information that we have about that. Historians are still trying to figure out where the land of Punt is. They put it anywhere between Ethiopia and Saudi Arabia today. So somewhere in there, but essentially coming down the Nile River or perhaps even the Red Sea. Now, along with that miniature model, we do have several full-size models within the museum, and all of these but one in the image is on display. And these show that the continent of Africa, as you move about, had a number of different vessels that they're going to use. Again, some of those civilizations that I mentioned at the beginning, and we can bring it all the way down to some of the tribal nations, they're going to have some variations. So starting here at the top, this first one here is called a chatty raft. And it's made out of reeds that are tied together. And what you see on the ends here are gourds. Now, these are very similar to pumpkins, which are a type of gourd, but these on this boat, you cannot eat. So they've been in human history for a long time where they're used for holding food. You can put water and other liquids in it. But in this case, they're actually keeping the boat afloat. So the idea is that you're going down the Nile River. We're not sure if you're sitting on the boat or if you're standing. But if you see off to the side here, this is going to be some kind of paddle that you're going to paddle your way down the Nile. And then after so many times, it is going to become waterlogged. So you're simply just going to untie your boat, put fresh reeds on it, reattach your gourds, and then you can continue using the boat. Now down below here, this is a dugout canoe that is from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And this one, when people see it, usually the first thing that we get is, well, how do you sit in it? You don't. You actually stand in it. So kind of think of like the Venetian gondolas, where you have someone who is standing and moving through. With this Congolese dugout canoe, you're kind of standing in the center or perhaps towards the rear or the stern of the boat, and you're pushing your way through. And this is how you would get things to market for trade. But again, you're standing up, not sitting down. If you're on the east coast of Africa, perhaps you may want to be in a double rigger canoe. And the double rigger simply means these two pieces that's going to balance your boat in the water. Now, this one is actually from Tanzania, and it is meant for the ocean, but you're not going far out. So you're in the ocean, but you're following the coastline. And again, you could use this for fishing and also trading items. Now, one of my favorite African boats in our collection is one that's not out on display, but this one here is Sankofa. And you remember the little bird that I mentioned to you, it's actually going to be right in here. This particular boat is actually was built in Ghana, and eventually it was brought to the Mariners Museum back in the 80s. We do rotate our boats from time to time. So Sankofa right now is in our storage, but I keep throwing it out there that we need to get it out. So that's just 4 of our boats, but we do have one more that I'm going to highlight as we move along. Now, I mentioned the east coast of Africa with our double outrigger canoe. And even today in 2023, another name for the east coast of Africa is known as the Swahili coast. And the Swahili coast simply means, or Swahili means of the shore. So people of the shore. And when you hear Swahili, it's not just for the coastline, but it's also for the people as well as the language. And this is the areas of Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, down in here, and even some of the islands along. And the Swahili have been moving up and down the eastern coast of Africa for centuries. And this right here is another model that we have at our museum. This is a dhow. And a dhow are ships are Arabic, and they would have been used in parts of the Indian Ocean. And you can even see some of these areas today actually are still in existence. So Lamu Island, for instance, has a very, very long history. But to go to Lamu Island today, you would actually have to fly from the mainland of Kenya out to the island, or actually fly into Kenya. You're going to take a boat to a smaller island. Then you're going to take a ferry from that island to Lamu. Once you get there, there are no cars, because there is pretty much one main road on Lamu Island. And so the only way that you can get from one end to the other is either walk it, you're going to ride a donkey, or they will have motor scooters. And I will tell you that from some of the things that I read, the older generations are not very happy about the motor scooters, but the younger generations enjoy them quite a bit. But a lot of Lamu Island has not changed. The architecture is still there from thousands of years ago, and they still use the same types of vessels, just like they did 1,000 years ago. So this right here is our Kenyan dhow that is on display at our museum. You'll notice that it says Lamu here. The Swahili were trading with parts of China as well as Asia and along the eastern coast. This one was actually donated to us in 2014 from the Smithsonian Folk Festival. The family actually were doing repairs on it, and then they were like, we don't know what to do with it. And somebody said, oh, send it to the Mariners Museum. And so it's been on display ever since. And I've actually had the pleasure of actually climbing on board the ship. I don't know if anybody can see that, but way in the background here, that is a toilet.
A big boat, but
It is a toilet. There's no plumbing for that, so we'll just let it go for that. But it was a workable vessel up until the point that we had it there. But we just enjoyed pointing that out to people, because then there's lots of questions that get asked about it. But this is a full-scale ship that we have, our boat in our collection here. Again, another example showing that these African civilizations do have a maritime history. And some of them are very long. If it's not on the ocean, it's going to be some body of water like rivers and lakes. And there are over 300 lakes and rivers throughout the continent of Africa. We usually talk about the big ones like the Nile, and don't forget the waterfalls that like Victoria Falls. So, and it's surrounded by water. So there is a huge maritime connection there. Now, as we stay in the continent of Africa, we are going to move to the western coast, and we have Abukari II. Now, what's interesting about Abukari II is he is, depending on which historian you're looking at, he's either the grandnephew or the grandson of Sundiata. Now, Sundiata or Sundiata was the first king of Mali. He is the founder of the Mali Empire. And what's interesting is most of you have heard his story, but it's told kind of in a unique way. I'm going to tell you what Sundiata's name means, and you'll figure out where you've heard the story. So Sundiata or Sundiata's name means the son of the buffalo woman and the Lion King. Does that sound familiar to anybody? And so, and actually the story of the Lion King, not Disney's version, but if you look back to the 14th and 15th century, you can follow Disney's version because it happens very similarly along the way, where he's kind of exiled. While he's in his exile, he comes across people who become his allies and kind of give him advice, and he learns to be the ruler that his father knew he could. He lost his father at an early age. He goes back to fight his uncle for control of the land. He takes his rightful place as king. But it actually comes from a very old story there. But what's unique about Abukari II, regardless of how he's related, he's most known about what he did. During the time of Abukari II, he's hearing rumors about getting from one place on what they know as the world from the other. And for Abukari II, he always had a feeling that the world was round. Even though there were Europeans that he had heard about at the time who were saying the world was flat, but he wanted to try to prove it. So he's actually going to send out a few ships, so it's about 5 to 10 ships, out into the Atlantic. As the ships are going out, one of the ships remains behind. He's kind of watching because these ships kind of disappear. And they're very fearful, so they go back to Abukari, and they're letting his family know that, well, something's not right. These ships have disappeared. And, well, we got to do something about this. So the king is like, no, I need to go out there and figure this out for myself. So he is going to abdicate the throne, and he's eventually going to leave. And instead of leaving out with the small number of ships in the first trip, he leaves out with about 200. And he heads out into the Atlantic. Now, the story that interests him, he's told that the ships disappeared into a river upon a river. And so he takes this journey, he disappears on that river within a river. Now, we're going to come back to his story in just a moment. But what else is interesting is this image right here. Now, there's another king that pops up. His name is Mansa Musa. And Mansa Musa, during his reign, makes the kingdom of Mali probably one of the wealthiest empires during that time. And we're talking about 1400s or so. And this right here is roughly the shape of his kingdom. Some historians have said that it was pretty much bigger than most of Western Europe. Now, Mansa Musa, as well as Abukari II, are practicing Muslims, and it is a pillar of Islam that you are going to take a trip to Mecca to pay homage, And that's exactly what he does. But keeping in mind that Mali is quite wealthy and he shows off the wealth of Mali. And the way that he does this is that he leaves Mali going across the Sahara Desert. He eventually comes up near the coastline towards the Mediterranean. He's making his way and he eventually gets to Egypt. The story is that along the way, he was quite generous to those who were in power, to any servants that were there, and that he's just passing out pieces of gold like it was candy. By the time he's actually in Egypt and making his way to Mecca and then his return trip, it is said that he had flooded the market in Egypt with so much gold that the price had dropped and stayed very, very low for the next 10 years. Again, showing just the wealth. The image that you see here is part of what's called the Cantillon map. And it was done to kind of show the kings and queens of that time period. Mansa Musa is the only African king shown on this map, and he's shown not as a small figure, but quite a large one. And can you kind of guess at what he's holding in his hand? Gold. He is holding gold. And so again, kind of showing the might of the kingdom of Africa, of Mali. We point this out again because you'll also notice that the kingdom of Mali is going to encompass the Niger River. And the Niger, just like many of the other rivers in Africa, are going to somewhat be a lifeline for many of these groups. At the very headwaters of the Niger are gold mines. Those who control the Niger control the gold mines. And that gold is going to flood this direction into northern Africa and eventually spread through Europe. Again, the kingdom of Mali. Now, as we're moving through the kingdom of Mali, we do know that Europeans are coming along during the time of exploration. And you'll notice that there's a question mark. Were there conquistadors, African conquistadors in the New World? The answer is yes, there were. There were a number of Africans who were traveling along with explorers like Ponce de Leon. They were going along with Balboa as well as Cortez. The image here is the only one that we were able to find, but it is said that a man by the name of Juan Garrido was born in West Africa in 1480. And that he actually moved from Africa to Portugal and then eventually stayed in Spain, but he comes across with several of the conquistadors, and it is said that he is considered to be the first Black conquistador that traveled with the Spanish. Now, he's gone to places like Haiti, he was in Puerto Rico. 1513, he is with Ponce de Leon as he is making his way through Florida and in search of the Fountain of Youth. Juan Garrido is also given distinction of being the first person to plant wheat outside of the indigenous populations. And there's also mention that he actually sent a letter kind of dictating his adventures to the King of Spain to actually get his pension. He eventually does get the pension, and he dies between about 1547, 1550. He left behind a wife and 3 children. Now, I mentioned we were going to come back to Abukari II, and a couple of things that we found very interesting when it comes to his story. Now, when we're talking about parts of Mexico and things where we always mention about the Aztecs, and as you move through, you've got the Incas and Mayans. Now, we know that the Aztecs and the Mayans do have one of their gods, and it's said that he disappeared in 99 AD, but tells of his return in 6 cycles. Now, a cycle is about 52 years, okay? And so 6 cycles or 312 years, which would be 1311. There is, let me say this, many of their gods are painted black. Just as a color for them, it's more about purity in a way. But it is said that he is going to return. Well, remember I mentioned that Abakari II is on this voyage across the Atlantic and gets caught within a river within a river. It is said, and this is an oral tradition, it is said that around 1313, a man who was burnt by the sun, dressed in the color white, with kind of a weird facial hair, was seen on parts of the coast of Mexico and several other countries there. It is quite possible, and historians have found evidence of Africans being along the coast of Mexico and other countries, and that's in some of the statues and things. So is it possible that Abakari II survived his journey across the ocean? It is possible. And what about that river within a river? Well, he was in one of the currents that flows through the Atlantic Ocean, probably the Canaries one that will take him directly there, and probably another one, the Gulf Stream as well. Again, depends on which historians you're looking at, but archaeology also is a thing. One other thing, so there's the 6 cycles later. Well, about 4 cycles later, 1519, a Spanish explorer by the name of Hernan Cortez pops up in Mexico and actually conquers or defeats the Aztecs. And the question is, when they first met him, did they consider him as one of their gods? Possibly, but he also overstayed his welcome. And so there was some severe fighting back and forth between the two. But return of a god, we don't know for sure. But it is a story, and again, the archaeology does point to that. Who wrote it down? Well, many of the different explorers did. So Balboa, who's in parts of Panama, wrote it down saying that he had saw dark-skinned men. And keeping in mind that many of these explorers have been on the west coast of Africa, so they would know the difference of Africans versus the indigenous populations that are there. Peter Maher is known as the first historian of the Americas. He also writes it down. The Mayans wrote it down in their own book that pops up. Christopher Columbus also mentioned seeing Africans as well as what he called African guinea gold. And that's been tested through archaeology as well. So again, possibly. But as we move through, and again, we're looking at just various times through history. This next one is always a very sensitive subject, but it's one that I feel that is necessary because we can't talk about Black maritime history without mentioning it. And that's a presentation for a whole nother time that we can get into. But what I wanted to point out is we do have a miniature model at the museum. It's called the Dos Amigos. And it is the actual ship, the Dos Amigos, was a vessel used during the transatlantic slave trade. But what's interesting is that its life did not start out that way. It actually started out as a trading vessel, and as countries were taking it over as their prize, they kind of converted it. Eventually, the ship is going to be captured because this one was designed around 1830. And during 1830, we're looking at the laws from what would be the United States, as well as England and parts of France. They had abolished the transatlantic slave trade, meaning you could not legally bring Africans from the continents over into the Americas. And there were ships who countries, particularly Britain, really gets into it, where they have a anti-slave patrol. So they're trying to catch these ships. Now, the Dos Amigos is actually going to be captured off of the western coast of Africa. They had gotten a number of enslaved people. When they realized they couldn't get out, They dropped the enslaved people off on a very tiny island and tried to make their way back up the Wari River. And that's where they're going to be captured. This is actually in our collection. It was made by two of our ship model makers who are no longer with us, but they got the plans for this particular ship. So it is as I said, a very touchy subject. It is a very dark period in world history, but it is a story that you do have to make mention of and kind of dive in. But as I said, that's another topic for another. Now, as we move through time, and again, keeping with kind of a maritime theme, I'm sure several of you have heard of Robert Smalls. If not, Robert Smalls was an enslaved person in South Carolina who, for a lack of a better word, stole. He stole the ship by the name of the CSS Planter. He was able to get his family and another group of enslaved Africans on board. Now, he had always been, since he was a young child, had always had a life at sea. So he knew a lot of the mannerisms. He knew all the various parts of the ship. He was also a very avid captain himself. One evening when the captain and his crew went aboard land, he dressed as the captain with the others in line and very carefully took the planter out into the South Carolina harbor. He eventually gets the ship to the United States port, turns the ship over, and then eventually joins the Union Navy. And he had about 17 different engagements during the Civil War. I will say that a lot of people focus on that. Myself, I like to mention what he did after the Civil War. So if you know a little about the Civil War, most may know that South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union. It's ironic that South Carolina, when they're headed back into the Union and they're looking for representatives, that they elect a Black man who stole a Confederate ship, and they elected him to represent them in government. And they didn't do it once, they didn't do it twice, they did it 5 times. 5 times. And so this is a picture of him during that time. So he must have been very, very good at what he did at that. But I think that's just pretty amazing when you think about South Carolina at the beginning of the Civil War and where they are afterwards. Now, at the Mariners Museum and Park, one of the stories that we like to share and talk about is that of the USS Monitor. We actually have the artifacts from the USS Monitor, which was one of 2 ironclads in 1862 that's going to be created. And there is a huge battle. It's the Battle of the Monitor versus the Virginia. You may have heard of it as the Monitor Merrimack. It's the same 2 ships. And essentially, this battle is going to take place if you're in Virginia, particularly in the Hampton Roads area, between the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel and the Monitor Merrimack Bridge Tunnel. That's where this battle is going to take place. So every time you go over one of those bridges, you are going over a battlefield. The Monitor was a Union vessel, had a crew anywhere between about 60 and 70, depending on what time frame you're looking at. We also know that there were 7 to 8 African Americans that served aboard ship. The reason why I say 7 to 8 is one of them was described as being extremely light-skinned. And we're not sure if he was light enough to pass as white. We don't know, but just the way that he is described, there's another term that's used for him in the census, but I'm just using that he was light enough to pass. So I hope everybody understands that there. We're not sure which one. But what we do know is that this man right here in the center, this image here, that is Siah Carter. He was an enslaved person who escaped from Shirley Plantation which is down Route 5 going towards Williamsburg and Charles City today. You can actually go there. They do more 18th century, but they also have a 19th century history as well. He escaped on a small vessel into the Hampton Roads Harbor, turns himself over, and he actually joins the crew of the USS Monitor. He does survive. The Monitor does sink on December 1st, 1862. Out of the 7 or 8 African Americans that were aboard, 3 of them had actually went down with the ship. If you get an opportunity to go to Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C., I highly recommend stopping by their grave marker. The marker for the USS Monitor crew, and it's for all 16 sailors that went down, is directly behind the tomb of the unknown soldier and right next to the memorial for the Challenger. If those of you that remember from the 1980s, so it's right in there. And it's weird because when we went there, we were just like, why did they put it right there? But it is there for all 16. This image here was actually taken after the battle, and it's actually the summer of 1862. It's pretty hot inside because this is a metal ship, and you can see that they decided to do their cooking and dishes outdoors, just to give you an idea. I mean, if you've been in Virginia, weather in summertime, you understand. Extremely hot. Now, along with that, wanted to highlight some other figures in history who have some maritime connections. So the one at the very top here, this is Crispus Attucks. Many people know him as the first man to lose his life at the beginning of the American Revolution, Boston Massacre. But you may not know that he actually was a whaler. He was a sea merchant and a rope maker. Again, first person as well as the first African American to lose his life in the Boston Massacre. Right next to him is Frederick Douglass, who many know as an orator, an author, and an editor of the abolitionist paper, the North Star. But as a very young man, young child as well, he had worked the docks in Maryland, caulking ships, kind of putting in the lining in between. Directly below Crispus Attucks is Paul Cuffey, who actually started his career as a whaler and a merchant. And he became quite successful at it that he owned his own fleet of ships. Matthew Henson down at the bottom is one of the first people, along with Robert Perry, as well as one of the first African Americans to reach the North Pole. But in his youth, he learned navigation as a cabin boy on board a ship called the Katie Hines. On the opposite side here is Daniel Hale Williams, who served as a steward on the Great Lakes as a steamer. His claim to fame in history is he is the first person to conduct the open heart surgery. And then down below him is Ralph W. Ellison, who during World War II joined the U.S. Merchant Marines as a cook. Most people know him better by the novel he wrote called The Invisible Man in 1953. We have a lot of people, when they come to the museum, they always ask, where's the Titanic? Because we do have a Titanic model. My mother is just a tiny bit obsessed with Titanic. For her, it's just about the movie.
Yeah.
It's the movie, and she's seen all versions of it. She doesn't care, she likes it. But one of the things that's very interesting is when I first started working at the museum, I always had school-age children who asked, were there any African Americans above on the Titanic? I used to say no. It's not entirely accurate. There may not have been any African Americans on there, but there was a man of African descent on board. And so his name is Joseph Laroche, and this is the only image that I can find of him and his family. So his wife, Juliette, his 2 children, Simone and Louise. Joseph is of Haitian descent, and at the age of 15, he had headed to France, where he studied to be an engineer. He was having trouble finding work, but as he was there, he fell in love with Juliet. They got married. They had 2 children. Because of the discrimination that was happening to him at the time, he decided to board a ship and bring his family back to his home nation of Haiti. He was not actually supposed to be on board the Titanic. He was on board another ship, but there was some issues and they decided, the ship actually decided to move the passengers to the Titanic. He is in 2nd class, which a lot of people find very interesting, but he is a 2nd class passenger. He does not survive the sinking of the Titanic. His family does. What's interesting is that we found out that Juliet was pregnant with their 3rd child while she was aboard. She does give birth to a boy who she names after his father. The family did live in destitute for a number of years until the court cases against the White Star Line and others were settled. But he, as far as we can tell, is the only man of African descent aboard Titanic, and he's the only one to lose his life. Now, something else, we do talk a lot about Navy, as you may have heard here, but this is an image from our collection, and this is 2 men aboard the USS Mason. Before I talk about this just for a second, looking at the picture there, doesn't it look like they're just having a bit of fun? A lot of us like to think there was some kind of snowball fight that took place before the image was taken. Yeah, and then they're getting like, I didn't do it. But what's interesting about the crew is that under fire during World War II, they actually repaired a number of ships that were in a convoy that they were carrying. And so they were, in 1994, then President Clinton actually gave them recommendations to the surviving members of the crew for their bravery. And there's a number of different instances like this that took place both during World War I and World War II. Hello. How are you?
I'm sorry, I just saw your program.
No, you're fine. Something else too, as we're thinking about the Navy, some of you may have heard of Carl Brashear. And Carl Brashear is the first African-American Master Chief Diver in the Navy at that time. In 1966, he lost his left leg in a shipboard instance. For anybody who loves movies, you may remember the movie Men of Honor. That was on Carl Brashear, and he was played by the actor Cuba Gooding. Thank you. Cuba Gooding Jr., and that is Carl Brashear right there. He died in 2006, but what's interesting about him, and I didn't put his ship in there, but not only is he the first African-American master diver, he was also the first person with a amputee or a disability as a diver in the United States Navy. There is a ship that's named after him, the USNS Carl Brashear. Along with that, we just have a few images of other African Americans, both male and female, that had significant contributions. Oh, here it is. Let's see. I didn't put the image in there. That's weird. First class diver, first amputee to serve in the United States Navy, which was 1968. And as the first African American master diver, that was 1970 when that took place. For the people that you see here, many of them are firsts. So you have Ensign Jesse L. Brown, who is the first African American naval aviator during World War II. Just below him, you have Olivia Hooker, who was the first African American woman to serve in the United States Coast Guard in the 1940s. She died a few years ago. She passed on November 1st, 2018 at the age of 103.
Wow.
You have Frances Eliza Wills and Harriet Ida Pickett, who are the first African American women commissioned into the United States Waves in 1944. Waves is women accepted for volunteer emergency service. Eventually, this turns into the women's branch of the United States Naval Reserves, and that was during World War II. It was established in 1942 by the Congress and signed by Franklin D. Roosevelt. We've got Master Chief Angela McShinnon, who is the first African-American woman to be a Master Chief in the Coast Guard. And there's an actual cutter that's supposed to be named for her. Vice Admiral Michelle Howard is the first African-American woman with the distinction of a 4-star admiral in the United States Navy. If you've seen the movie or heard the story of Captain Phillips, she was actually the commander who is leading the charge for his rescue. By Tom Hanks for the Somalian pirates. She was actually in charge at the time of overseas with his rescue. She was also on President Biden's transition team when he first came in. And I forgot, she is now a professor in cyber intelligence, and I forgot what college she's at right now. Dory Miller, he was a football player who eventually is going to end up in the Navy. He was used as a cook, but under attack, and this is right around Pearl Harbor, his ship is going to be attacked. It almost splits in two, and he was sent to save as many as he could. He ends up also saving his captain.
So he was the one that played,
Yes.
So
Yes, he was in, if you've seen the movie Pearl Harbor, he does pop up in there. But sadly, he loses his life, I believe, on the Indianapolis that also gets under attack. He does get medals after his death. And currently the Newport News shipyard is building an aircraft carrier that is named for him, and it's tentatively going to be commissioned in 2030 for that. Just a list of other ships that have been named after African Americans. So you've got Dory Miller at the top. Remember, I mentioned Jesse L. Brown, who's our first naval aviator. George Washington Carver. Then you've got all the way down to Medgar Evers. You've got U.S. Gravely, who's also named after a very prominent African-American officer, all the way down to Pickney. And I had to do it. I had to put in Hidden Figures because I think most people have seen the movie, you've heard the stories. But this one is particular focus on space exploration. And that is one thing that we also talk about at the museum, because as the astronauts are coming down, they do end up in the oceans. And so there is a connection to exploration of the ocean as well as the sky. But this portion is actually not to focus on these three women. It's actually on the Navy's hidden figure. And so this is Regine Montague, and very similar to the ladies in the movie Hidden Histories, as they started off in an office and are kind of working their way up. She actually does the same thing. At one point in time, she's actually the program manager, and the United States government comes to her department, and they are demanding, they want a schematic for an aircraft carrier using computers. Before then, it's all done by hand, but this is going to be different. They gave her a month. Her department was given a month to come up with this plan. She did it in 18 hours.
Good.
She did it in 18 hours with this. And real quickly, let me read you a little bit about what else she's going to take place with. So yes, 18 hours is when she gets that done. And this new design is for the Oliver Hazard Perry class of ships. This was the first one designed by computer. 1970, she's going to be awarded a civilian service award which was the Navy's third highest honorary award. She is the first female professional engineer to receive the Society of Manufacturing Engineering Achievement Award. Many others. She's also hosted honors from not just the Navy, but several other military branches. She worked on the USS Dwight Eisenhower and also the Navy's first landing craft helicopter assault ship. Her last project was the Seawolf class submarine. She retired in 1990. Sad to say, she passed away in 2018. Also, because of the area that we live in, you have the seafood industry. These are just a few images from our collections. African Americans, both male and female, have worked the docks. They were watermen, they were oystermen, they were crab pickers. We also looked up what they're getting paid, and the pay, there's a quite discrepancy in what they're getting. With that. This image right here is actually a more modern one. The photographer wanted to do it in black and white with that. And that is Julius, I think Burns is his name, or Barnes. And he's actually still living, I believe, with that. Just a few other things when we're talking about the ocean. William Pickney in 1992 became the first African American to solo navigate the world. And that is the ship in which he did it. You have Dr. Dawn Wright, who became the first African-American woman to work with Alvin, which is a submersible that's used by the varying organizations and government to do things on the ocean floor with that. She was known as Deep Sea Dawn. And as I mentioned, first, I didn't mention this one, she's the first Black woman to explore the ocean floor in a submersible. And the Alvin, I believe, is only 1 or 2 people that can fit in that. And just to kind of continue with this, when we think about sailing, there's lots of different sailing clubs and yacht clubs, and these are just a few that are all African American. So you've got Marcus Asante and Universal Sailing Club, Amy Sinclair and Sailing Noir. Both of those are out of Baltimore. And then you have the country's oldest African-American yacht club, which is the Seafarers Yacht Club out of Baltimore. And I believe they were just in the area like last summer. They had come up here for something, because somebody mentioned that to me with that, which was kind of cool. And then, as I mentioned, if we're going below waters, we also have the Friendly Skies. And so Madeline Swagel in 2020 became the first Black female tactical fighter pilot. And I think she's still going through a bit of training, but she's eventually going to end up joining, the Red Hawks of the training squadron out of Texas. November of 2020, NASA, I can't speak today, I'm so sorry. Astronaut Victor Glover launched on his very first space flight, and he became the first African-American astronaut to live at the International Space Station. We're still trying to figure out if he is still up there or has he come back yet. We haven't found it yet, but we're still looking. But it was supposed to be a 6-month deployment there. But as I said, we don't know if he's still there. But that makes him the very first one. And then, as I mentioned, we got to bring it completely to modern times. And in our area, Captain Janet Days, last Friday, became the first African-American woman to command Naval Station Norfolk.
Biggest in the world.
It's in the world. So 51st commander of Naval Station Norfolk, which is just very cool in itself that history continues to be made. Now, this is always a proverb that I absolutely love, and it does make perfect sense. Until the story of the hunt is told by the lion, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. It's an African proverb. So as I mentioned about some subjects that we do talk about that are very, very sensitive, if we don't feel comfortable talking about it, we can't expect someone else to feel comfortable with the conversation as well. So we're very open at the Mariners Museum, so if you all have any questions about what we've covered here, if there's something we didn't cover and you're interested, please feel free to contact us at the museum. You can get all of our information on the website. If you want to reach out to me directly, wperry@marinersmuseum.org. And I am the only Wisteria at the museum, so if you say my name or get close to it, they'll know who you're talking about. But with that, I just want to say thank you all so much. If you do have questions right now, please feel free to ask those.
That was a lovely presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming.
You're welcome.
Well,